The funeral of Cyril Midgley was, as far as such occasions can be, a model of modest Flaxborough propriety. The weather, drizzling with occasional conviction, had encouraged a briskness of attendance that the late Mr. Midgley might have appreciated. He had been known, after all, for preferring matters done quickly, quietly, and without the flim-flam that he accused modern commerce of encouraging. Inspector Purbright found himself in the church not through professional obligation, but owing to the memory of a narrow walnut bureau that Midgley had once all but forced him to buy. It still stood in his sitting room, its drawers protesting indignantly whenever opened. Purbright liked to think they provided an honest commentary on the state of British carpentry. The church was nearly full. Flaxborough's citizenry could always be relied upon to attend a funeral, particularly one belonging to a tradesman who had extended credit liberally but collected debts frugally. There was, however, an air of faint anticipation. This was not unusual. Funerals were often treated as small civic gatherings where one might confirm who was still alive and whose reputation, recently challenged, had survived. The service began smoothly. The choir, consisting of 6 elderly gentlemen and 2 women of rather more authoritative posture, worked their way through The Day Thou Gavest with commendable stamina. The vicar, the Reverend Pottle, approached the lectern with his habitual stoop, as though to apologize for the height it forced upon him. Purbright was observing Mrs. Glossop's elaborate hat, which appeared to contain more feathers than the average rook, when the first disturbance occurred. It was not a sound that announced itself clearly. Indeed, several mourners would later admit that they wondered at first whether they had imagined it. A soft whisper slithered across the quiet, thin as a draught, but unmistakably human. It seemed to come from behind the heavy velvet curtain that screened off the storage alcove near the choir stalls. A few heads turned. Purbright, unhurried as ever, simply lifted his gaze in the direction of the curtain. It hung motionless, though its folds were deep enough to hide a small army, let alone a single person. Reverend Pottle paused, perhaps sensing a shift in temperature rather than having heard anything himself. He cleared his throat gently and continued reading the commendation, though with an added quaver. Then, there was no mistaking it this time, a whisper again. 3 distinct syllables, soft but intent. They seemed to glide through the nave like a breath purposely directed. Mrs. Glossop stiffened. Mr. Froldsham, whose hearing aids tended to interpret the world with unnecessary generosity, blinked as though recognizing the voice of a long-forgotten creditor. The choir mistress clasped her hymnal with sudden severity. Purbright leaned slightly forward. He did not react beyond that. Many years of police work had taught him that the first reaction of the average citizen to an unusual occurrence was not fear, but interpretation. People seldom admitted ignorance when a good guess could be made. By the time the final hymn had been sung and the congregation began filing out into the charitable drizzle, speculation had already begun to ferment. "I distinctly heard it," Mrs. Glossop declared to any who would listen. "A woman's voice. It said, 'Look behind you.'" I was frozen, positively petrified. Poor Cyril's spirit must have been unsettled. Mr. Froldsham, affronted by such naivete, shook his head. "Nonsense. It said, 'Book overdue,' and it was a man, quite firm too, accountant-like." The choir mistress insisted that the whisper had formed her own name, a claim which brought her a gratifying amount of attention, though partly of a sympathetic nature. Purbright, stepping out into the churchyard, was intercepted by Reverend Pottle. The vicar's expression was one of careful worry, as though unsure what proportion of his concern should be pastoral and how much practical. "Inspector, forgive me," he murmured, drawing Purbright aside. "I hesitate to trouble you at such a moment, but did you by any chance notice anything untoward during the service?" Purbright considered. "Untoward, sir?" "A whisper," the vicar said, lowering his voice further. "Some of the congregation appear unsettled." "Yes," Purbright replied gently. "I heard something, though not clearly enough to give it meaning." Reverend Pottle exhaled in faint relief. "I feared it might be one of the choir boys playing tricks, though of course we haven't had any choir boys since 1987. Still, I should dislike the idea of intrusive elements at funerals." Purbright looked toward the velvet curtain. "I don't suppose you keep anything behind there that might produce noises?" "Only old music stands and a malfunctioning heater, but the heater hasn't worked since Easter, and even then it hummed rather than whispered." The vicar's concern seemed genuine enough. Purbright, however, had noted something more interesting, the eagerness with which the mourners had attempted to give content to the whisper. In Flaxborough, an unexplained event was not a puzzle, but an opportunity, usually for embellishment. He walked toward the lich gate, observing small clusters of townspeople exchanging murmured interpretations. It struck him that the whisper, though faint, had achieved a rather disproportionate influence. Some events, it seemed, required little more than the barest prompt to awaken a town's appetite for drama. Purbright paused under his umbrella. He looked back at the church. The curtain hung still, impenetrable in its folds. It was not the whisper that concerned him. Such things had explanations ranging from the sensible to the theatrical, but the particular reactions it had provoked. Mrs. Glossop's fear, Mr. Frolsham's certainty, the choir mistress's sudden attention, and above all the widow's curious silence. She had left the church swiftly, eyes lowered, declining condolences with a brevity unusual even for grief. The inspector filed these impressions away without urgency. Flaxborough's mysteries often began with matters trivial or absurd, but they rarely ended that way. He stepped out into the damp afternoon, the whisper lingering in memory like a draught in a closed room. Unsettling, not because of what it said, but because of who might have been meant to hear it. By the following morning, the whisper at Midgley's funeral had acquired a peculiarly robust vocabulary, an impressive achievement, considering how few of the original words anyone had genuinely heard. Flaxborough's rumour mill, reliable as ever, had begun its day with an enthusiasm that would have flattered any international press agency. Mrs. Glossop, fortified by a night's sleep and a fresh sense of dramatic purpose, now insisted that the whisper had unmistakably said, "Beware the one who mourns too loudly." This had prompted a ripple of speculation across the high street, especially among those who had noticed that Mrs. Pargeter had sobbed with startling punctuality at every pause in the service. By 9:30, the theory had expanded. A man from the hardware shop opined that the whisper was, in fact, a coded message, quite possibly relating to a clandestine affair between the deceased and a married woman, whose identity he had not yet decided upon, but was willing to infer from hat size and seating preference. Such was the climate into which Inspector Purbright strolled as he approached the market square on his way to the station. He paused a moment beside the vegetable stall, not out of culinary interest, but because Mrs. Glossop was holding court nearby. She was recounting the incident to a small but enthralled trio consisting of Mr. Frolisham, the postmistress, and a youth whose sole motive for listening appeared to be the hope of hearing something scandalous enough to repeat in the schoolyard. "And then," Mrs. Glossop breathed, dramatically lowering her voice, "the whisper said, 'She knows.' Terrifying, really. I felt it in my very bones." Purbright watched the assembled listeners digest this addition with solemn attention. Mr. Frolisham, affronted, cleared his throat. "It did not say that at all," he declared. "It said, 'You owe.' Quite plainly, could be a threat, of course, but more likely a reminder. I suspect Mr. Midgley had unresolved business affairs. The youth, evidently impressed, nodded with the air of someone who had just discovered accounting could be weaponized. Purbright moved on before his presence could throttle the speculation. He had no desire to encourage or discourage the rumors. The vitality with which they propagated was often more useful to him when left undisturbed. People revealed more about themselves when talking, freely, especially under the heady influence of collective mystery. Outside the station, Constable Malley was sweeping damp leaves from the doorstep with exaggerated diligence. He straightened at the inspector's approach, adopting a look of importance. "Morning, sir. Quite the stir about that whisper yesterday. Half the town's talking about it. Some say it was a message from the grave." "Most messages from the grave," Purbright replied mildly, "tend to be written down with legal assistance. Anything more ethereal should be treated with caution." Malley nodded earnestly, as though committing this to a growing catalogue of profound truths. "Well, sir, if you're asking me, I reckon it was some sort of prank. Young Colin Smeaton was seen lurking about the churchyard last week. He's always up to something, might have slipped behind that curtain for a lark." Purbright refrained from commenting. Malley's eagerness to assign responsibility so quickly was characteristic of a man who believed crime, like milk, should be kept fresh and easily traceable. Still, the mention of Smeaton was noted. Every rumour, however premature, had its uses. Purbright made his way to his office, where Sergeant Love, hunched over paperwork, looked up with the expression of a man hoping the inspector had returned with a simple burglary rather than a metaphysical whisper. "Morning, sir. I suppose you've heard about the business with the voice?" "I was present," Purbright replied, removing his coat. "It seems to have grown since then." "That it has." Love rubbed his temples. "Got a call earlier from Mrs. Sneath. She claims the whisper said her name, twice, apparently. She's worried her husband arranged it to frighten her into giving up her bingo nights." "An innovative marital tactic," Purbright murmured. The sergeant sighed. "And Miss Priddy, the florist, was in earlier. Looked rather shaken. Said she'd overheard talk that the whisper mentioned a flower. She asked if there'd be an investigation into whether the message was intended to ruin her business." Purbright looked up. "Did she say which flower?" "No, sir. Only that she'd heard it was something botanical and sinister." This description, though lacking scientific rigour, intrigued Purbright sufficiently to consider visiting her later. Miss Priddy was known to possess a temperament as brittle as her floral arrangements. Anything that unsettled her was worth noting. For now, however, Purbright wished to revisit the scene itself. Churches, in his experience, preserve disturbances much as attics preserve the belongings of overly thrifty relatives. Reverend Pottle was in the vestry polishing a brass candlestick with the resigned air of a man constantly outmatched by ecclesiastical metalwork. He greeted Purbright with subdued relief. "Inspector, thank you for coming. The congregation's—" Enthusiasm has become rather overwhelming. "Someone suggested the church is haunted." Haunted! Cyril Midgley was a Methodist in spirit, if not in practice. I cannot imagine him lingering in Anglican precincts. Purbright allowed a faint smile. "May I have another look at the curtain?" "Of course. I've had no one near it since yesterday." It seemed wise. The curtain hung as before, heavy, crimson, faintly perfumed with the scent of old velvet. Purbright ran a careful hand along its edge. Nothing unusual, no mechanisms, no concealed speakers. He stepped into the alcove behind it. A small space, confined and dim, containing stacked music stands, a folding screen, and an electric heater whose cord had long since surrendered to frayed uselessness. From the alcove's narrow vantage, Purbright noted an interesting detail. Through a small slit where the curtain didn't quite meet the wall, The view of the congregation would have been partial, but sufficient to observe reactions. Someone hoping to avoid being seen could easily wait here and whisper at the most dramatic moment. Yet this did not entirely satisfy him. The panic of the choir mistress, the certainty of Mr. Frolisham, the widow's retreat, each hinted at separate interpretations, which seldom occurred unless the stimulus had been very faint indeed. A half-heard whisper was perfect soil for imagination. But why whisper at all, and to whom? He thanked the vicar and stepped outside where the rain had slackened to a mist fine enough to coat everything with a glistening uncertainty. He paused near the churchyard gate and observed the florist's shop across the street. Miss Priddy stood inside, arranging carnations with the tense precision of someone pretending not to watch the world watching her. A voice behind him cleared its throat. "Inspector Purbright." He turned to see Mrs. Midgley, the widow, her black coat immaculate, her eyes composed but distant. "I hope to speak with you," she said, her tone low. "Not about the whisper, about Cyril." Purbright waited, giving her time. "There are things about my husband's last weeks," she continued carefully, "that trouble me. Small things, but I felt the whisper meant something, not what others say, something else." Purbright regarded her gently. "Did you recognize the voice?" She hesitated. "No," she said at last. "But I recognized the fear I felt. It was not the sort of fear caused by a prank or by gossip. It had depth, history." Purbright inclined his head slightly. "Mrs. Midgley," he said, "if there is something you wish to tell me, I shall listen carefully." She shook her head. "Not yet. I must be certain first." And without another word, she walked away, leaving Purbright with the distinct sense that the whisper, whatever its source, had struck a note not of melodrama, but of warning. A warning meant for someone specific, and someone who had heard it very clearly indeed. Inspector Purbright, mindful of the widow's unresolved apprehension, began the next morning with a quiet determination to anchor the growing cloud of rumours to something resembling fact. Flaxborough's appetite for embellishment was admirable in its way, but unless trimmed early, it tended to develop the sort of wings that bore it far from any earthly truth. And Purbright, though patient, preferred his mysteries terrestrial. He started at the church again, arriving just as the Reverend Pottle was concluding a discussion with the choir mistress, Mrs. Beddington, who was examining a hymn book as though it were personally responsible for her distress. The moment she saw Purbright, her expression rearranged itself into a look of dignified suffering. "Oh, Inspector," she said, clasping the hymnal tightly to her bosom, "I hardly slept. The whisper repeated itself all night in my imagination, a terrible, insinuating sound, like a cold finger running down one's spine." "Memory is capable of remarkable embroidery," Purbright replied with gentle neutrality. "Still, perhaps you might tell me precisely what you heard at the time." Mrs. Beddington lowered her voice dramatically. "It said my name, Clara, plain as day, twice." "Twice?" Purbright asked mildly. "Well, once distinctly, and then I sensed a second attempt, a sort of ghost of the first." Her eyes glimmered anxiously. "You see what that implies?" Purbright refrained from encouraging such implication. Instead, he asked, "Did you see anything? Movement behind the curtain? A figure?" She shook her head. "Only a tremor, a slight ripple. Of course, with velvet you cannot be certain. It behaves in peculiar ways, but I did not imagine that voice. No woman forgets her own name being spoken in such a tone." The inspector thanked her and turned to the Reverend Pottle, who looked as though he longed to escape to the safety of brass polishing. The vicar directed him toward the choir pews with a resigned gesture, and Purbright took the opportunity to speak with two of the elderly male choristers who were busily straightening sheet music. Neither had heard anything of great clarity. One believed the whisper had said biscuit, a theory he defended staunchly on the grounds that Cyril Midgley had been especially fond of custard creams. The other maintained that the whisper was merely a burst of air from the organ, despite the organ being quite unplayed at the moment. Purbright listened without dismissal. In Flaxborough, even misinterpretations could point to what mattered, the angle from which each person heard or imagined the event, and each insisted on a different angle. Satisfied he had gleaned all he could from the choir, he next sought the help of the undertaker's assistant, Herbert Sims, a pale young man whose professional demeanour suggested he had been born with a solemn expression and had never once startled anyone in his life. Sims received the inspector in the undertaker's dimly lit office with a respectful bow. "Very regrettable business, sir," he murmured. "A funeral ought to be peaceful, even if the deceased never was." "Quite," Purbright said. "You were assisting at Mr. Midgley's service. Did you notice the whisper?" Sims nodded gravely. "I did hear something, sir. It didn't sound like speech to me. More like, well, a hiss. The sort of noise someone makes when they mean to speak, but changes their mind halfway through. Not uncommon among those overcome with emotion." "Did you see anything unusual near the curtain?" Sims hesitated. "I thought it moved, but only slightly. Could have been a draught. Hard to say. Velvet tends to waver." "Yes," Purbright agreed. "Velvet is known for its uncertainties." The young man offered a look of gratitude for the sympathetic understanding. "There's one thing, sir," he added softly. "The widow, Mrs. Midgley, she stood very still when the whisper came. Most people glanced about or shifted, but she seemed listening." Purbright felt a faint tightening of interest. "Did she seem alarmed?" "No, sir. More like someone hoping a noise was meant for her." This observation, small and gently delivered, lingered in the inspector's thoughts as he left the undertaker's. It did not fit comfortably with the widow's earlier claim of fear, though grief often bent memory in peculiar shapes. He paused outside the florist's. Miss Priddy, immaculate as always, was arranging lilies with a precision suggestive of military drill. When Purbright entered, she startled slightly, then forced her expression into one of polite neutrality. "Inspector," she said, her voice sharp as a rose thorn, "if you're here about the whisper, I can tell you at once that I heard nothing. Absolutely nothing. I was too far back in the church." "I understood you were in the third pew from the front," Purbright said gently. She blinked, flush rising. "Well, yes, but I was focused on my tribute bouquet. I cannot be expected to note every stray sound." "Of course not," he replied. "I merely wondered if anything struck you as odd at the time." "Odd?" she huffed. "Aside from half the town deciding the church has developed a supernatural public address system? No, Inspector, I am a florist, not a psychic, and I don't appreciate people insinuating otherwise." Purbright allowed the outburst to settle. Anger, in his experience, was seldom free-floating. It clung to something. "I understand," he said, "though I did hear you visited the station yesterday." Miss Priddy froze. "Purely to ensure malicious talk did not spread. Rumours can damage reputations, Inspector, especially when one is self-employed." "Naturally," Purbright said, "reputation is a fragile thing." Miss Priddy seemed about to speak again, but thought better of it. She returned to her lilies with crisp determination, each stem placed as though it were an argument being won. Purbright left without pressing her further. Fear and defensiveness often shared the same tone, and he had no wish to blur them before distinguishing their sources. His next concern was the widow. She had avoided town that morning, and none of her neighbours could say where she had gone. Purbright considered seeking her out, but something in her demeanour the previous day suggested she would come to him when ready. He walked instead back toward the church, turning over in his mind the matter of the curtain. There was a contradiction he could not force into alignment. 2 witnesses claimed the curtain had moved, yet only one swore to seeing a hand emerge, a claim the choir mistress denied emphatically, while others insisted she had been too busy correcting hymn timing to notice. The inspector paused at the churchyard gate, looking once more at the thick velvet folds. A whisper, faint enough to be misheard by all but believed by many, required someone willing to approach the moment with precision. Someone who understood the acoustics of that corner, someone who knew where each mourner sat, someone who had reason to send a message without being seen. These thoughts accompanied him back to the station, where Sergeant Love awaited with a fresh report. "Sir," Love said, lifting a slip of paper. "Something peculiar. Young Colin Smeaton denies everything naturally, but says he did see someone lingering near the vestry door after the service, dressed in dark clothing, couldn't say who." "Ah," Purbright murmured. Another whisper added to the collection. Yet behind his mild tone, a strand of curiosity tightened. If someone had indeed lingered near the vestry immediately after the whisper was heard, then the incident was no mere mischief. It had a shape, a direction, and, he suspected, a recipient. But for the moment it remained only a faint disturbance, like a draught trapped behind a curtain, waiting for someone patient enough to listen carefully. Constable Malley arrived at Inspector Purbright's office the next morning, wearing the expression of a man who had single-handedly untangled a conspiracy of national significance. He stood at attention, boots damp from a morning shower, cap crooked with earnest haste. Purbright, who had been reviewing a stack of mundane reports involving stray dogs and a disputed parking space behind the bakery, looked up politely. "Sir," Malley announced, "I've identified the culprit behind the whisper." Purbright allowed himself a mild pause, during which he weighed the likelihood of Malley unearthing a revelation before breakfast. "Indeed." "Yes, sir. It's that Smeaton boy, Colin, always hanging about the churchyard. Likes playing tricks with those imitation ghost whistles you get at fairs. He's been seen skulking near the vestry twice in the last week. Mrs. Rudge spotted him near the flower beds only an hour before the funeral. Very suspicious." Purbright set down his pen with delicate care. "Skulking is, I agree, rarely a wholesome pastime, but skulking alone does not constitute an indictment." Malley nodded vigorously as if this was something he had already considered. "There's more, sir. I spoke with him directly. Asked him if he'd been behind the curtain during the service. He went bright red. Couldn't look me in the eye. Said it wasn't him, but wouldn't explain what he had been doing at the church that morning. Classic signs of guilt." "Or adolescence," Purbright murmured, "which can produce similar symptoms." Malley blinked. "Sir?" "Never mind," Purbright said gently. "Thank you. I will speak with him myself." Malley withdrew, satisfied he had nudged the investigation onto what he believed the most straightforward rails. Purbright, meanwhile, suspected those rails led nowhere in particular. Still, speaking with young Smeaton would not hurt, and in Flaxborough, even the innocent often revealed useful truths while defending themselves. The inspector found the boy behind the tobacconist's shop, where he was attempting to coax a reluctant cat from under a crate. Colin Smeaton, narrow-shouldered and permanently tousled, straightened at the sight of Purbright approaching. "Morning, Inspector," he said with wary politeness. "If this is about the cat, it's not mine." "I had no reason to suppose it was," Purbright replied. though if it claims otherwise I shall revisit the matter. I wanted to ask you about something more substantial." Colin swallowed. "The whisper?" "Indeed. Constable Malley mentioned you were near the church on the morning of the funeral. You denied being behind the curtain, but hesitated about your reason for being there." Colin scuffed his shoe against the pavement. "I wasn't doing anything wrong, sir. Honest." "I do tend to assume innocence," Purbright said reassuringly. "What were you doing?" The boy hesitated again. Then, in a rush, he said, "I was putting something back." "Back?" "A hymn sheet, number 94. I borrowed it last week, needed it for a school project on Victorian handwriting and thought the library copy didn't look old enough. I meant to slip it back on the stack before anyone noticed, but the choir mistress came in earlier than usual, and I had to leg it." Purbright regarded him. It was absurd enough to be perfectly true. "And during the funeral?" "I was there, but outside, not in the church. I wouldn't dare go in after that. Everyone would have known I'd been where I shouldn't." This explanation, delivered with the earnest panic of a boy who feared adults far more than divine judgment, rang true. Purbright thanked him and advised him gently to ask permission before borrowing church materials. Colin nodded fervently and scurried off with the cat trotting behind him, now apparently deciding to accept his guardianship after all. Purbright continued along the high street, reflecting on the hymn sheet detail. It seemed trivial on its surface, yet it stuck in the mind. Why would a choir mistress arrive earlier than usual? Why would she be so quick to assert that the whisper had spoken her name? Why would she attempt to restore order to the hymn stack immediately afterward, as the vicar had noted? Sometimes the smallest objects marked the edges of larger disturbances. Farther down the street stood the councillor's office, a tidy brick building displaying posters about drainage meetings and recycling initiatives. Councilman Hargreave emerged at that moment, coat flapping, moustache bristling with administrative purpose. Upon seeing Purbright, his face rearranged into the expression of a man prepared to contribute importantly to civic stability. "Inspector," Hargreave exclaimed, "I hope you're putting a stop to this whisper nonsense. Terribly destabilizing. I've had 3 constituents ask whether we will need to erect signs warning visitors of supernatural phenomena. Preposterous." "I understand you attended the funeral," Purbright said mildly. "Of course. Cyril Midgley was a respectable tradesman. Terrible loss. Though between us, his pricing on dining sets was occasionally optimistic." Purbright allowed that to float past. "Did you hear the whisper yourself?" Hargreave's eyes flickered. "Heard? Not precisely. A noise, yes, very faint. Probably the heater coming on. Those old things wheeze like dying cows." "The heater is broken," Purbright replied gently. "Oh, well, then perhaps a bird. Birds have no respect for funerals." Purbright studied him. Hargreave's insistence on mundanity was itself suspicious. He was overcompensating, brushing away the matter with the haste of someone anxious to remove a stain before it's set. "Where were you sitting?" Purbright asked. "Back right pew. Good view of proceedings. Keeps one out of range of projecting choir spit." "Did you observe anything unusual afterwards? Anyone near the vestry, for instance?" Hargreave shook his head promptly, too promptly before softening his tone. "No one I recognized. Someone in dark clothing, possibly. I didn't look closely. I tend to avoid loiterers. Never know what they want." Purbright nodded. "Thank you." As Hargreave hurried off, fussing with his umbrella, the inspector felt a mild yet definite tug of interest. The councillor had been firm in his denials, yet his eyes had betrayed a tension entirely absent from the other witnesses. Could Hargreave have been the person Colin Smeaton glimpsed after the service? And if so, why had he lingered? Returning to the station, Purbright found Sergeant Love sorting through a surprising stack of new reports. Gossip had now begun producing official statements. 2 more people insist the whisper said their name, Love muttered. Mr. Cadwell claims it told him to repent, though given his habit of short-changing people at his sweet shop, that might have been his conscience. And the choir mistress? Purbright asked. Left a message. Wants to clarify the pronunciation of her name as heard in the whisper. Something about vowel length. Purbright suppressed a sigh. Very well. He sat, allowing the morning's impressions to settle. The town had eagerly selected its villain, young Smeaton, inconvenient, mischievous, and suitably unthreatening. The narrative fit so neatly it could only be wrong. People preferred a suspect whose guilt made emotional sense, even if it made no factual sense. But Purbright considered the whisper itself, not its content, distorted beyond recovery by gossip, but its intent. It had been directed, not random, soft, precise, emerging at a moment designed for maximum effect. It had struck the widow, unsettled the choir mistress, and nudged Councilman Hargreave into a defensive narrative. Purbright leaned back and steepled his fingers. Someone had wanted to be heard, but barely. Someone had wanted to frighten, but only a select few. And someone, he suspected, had misjudged how far a whisper could travel when carried by a town whose favourite pastime was suspicion wrapped in civility. Malley's convenient suspect was no more than smoke. The real figure stood somewhere behind the velvet curtain of motive and opportunity, waiting for Purbright to pull the fabric aside. Morning light struggled through the thin veil of mist that had settled over Flaxborough, turning the high street into a landscape of blurred outlines and hesitant footsteps. Inspector Purbright, coat buttoned neatly against the damp, made his way toward Miss Priddy's florist shop with a sense that the day would not be generous with straightforward answers. The whisper had grown into such a tangle of interpretations that even silence now seemed suspicious. He reached the shop just as Miss Priddy was unlocking the door. Her movements were sharp, almost brittle, as though each gesture risked shattering something delicate within her. She glanced over her shoulder, saw Purbright, and immediately attempted to arrange her features into polite composure. "Inspector," she said, a fraction too quickly. "If you're here about arrangements for the school fundraiser, I'm fully booked." "I'm here about something simpler," Purbright replied gently. "A brief word, if you have the time." Her eyes narrowed. "If this is about the whisper again, I've nothing to add. People have been speculating wildly. It's bad for business. Customers do not appreciate supernatural associations with memorial blooms." "I can imagine," Purbright said. "But no, I'm not here to ask what you heard. I'm curious about something Constable Malley mentioned. Your concern yesterday about rumours connecting the whisper to flowers." Miss Priddy stiffened. "I said no such thing. I simply didn't want gossip implicating my shop in dramatics." "Of course," Purbright said pleasantly. "May I step inside?" Reluctantly, she moved aside. The interior smelled of lilies, eucalyptus, and anxiety. Buckets of fresh stems lined the walls, but several bouquets sat half-arranged as though she had abandoned them mid-thought. "I had a delivery issue this morning," she said, almost defensively. A wreath arrived at the rear door, no sender, no card. "I assumed it was an early drop-off for a funeral later this week, but when I checked the schedule, nothing matched." "And the wreath itself?" "It's in the back." She hesitated. "I didn't like handling it. Something felt off." Purbright followed her through a curtain into the storeroom. There, on a workbench, lay an elegant wreath of white roses and laurel leaves, perfectly composed, almost too perfect. Purbright examined it closely. "Unusual," he murmured. "Very symmetrical, and the wiring is professional." "I thought so," Miss Priddy said, arms folded tightly. "But look here." She pointed to a slip of paper, tucked discreetly beneath one of the roses. Purbright drew it out carefully. It was part of a funeral program, Cyril Midgley's, torn from the bottom edge. One line of text had been circled in dark pencil. Order of committal. When did you find this? This morning. I noticed the corner poking out. I didn't put it there. No name with the wreath? None, and the delivery boy swears he didn't bring it. Purbright studied her face. Under her smart, meticulous exterior, Miss Priddy looked genuinely unsettled. Her lips were pursed tighter than usual, and the pale skin beneath her eyes suggested a night short on sleep. What did you do when you discovered the paper? He asked. She hesitated again, long enough for Purbright to recognize the moment when truth and concealment argued silently. I destroyed it, she said at last. Burned it in the sink. I didn't want customers seeing anything ghoulish. Ghoulish, Purbright echoed. Or incriminating. Her eyes flashed, and for a second the facade cracked. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then shut it firmly. I've nothing to hide, Inspector. Purbright inclined his head in polite acceptance. Did Mrs. Midgley order any flowers recently? No, Miss Priddy said. But the Councillor Hargreave ordered lilies 2 days before the funeral, white ones, said they were for a private matter. I assumed he meant a condolence gesture, though he didn't send them to the widow. Purbright considered this. And he didn't say who they were intended for? No, he seemed irritable, as though I had asked something impertinent. A faint bell tinkled from the shop, signalling the arrival of a customer. Miss Priddy stiffened again, clearly unwilling to continue the conversation. If that will be all, Inspector, she said, I must open. Purbright stepped aside. Thank you, Miss Priddy. As she hurried back toward the front, Purbright paused by the wreath once more. The circled words order of committal stirred a quiet suspicion. Why highlight that particular line of the service? It was not unusual, not personal, not symbolic in any specific way, unless, of course, the intent was not symbolic, but instructional. Someone had wanted Miss Priddy to notice this. Someone who believed she would understand its meaning. As he stepped outside, a drizzle began to fall again, soft and persistent. Purbright turned up his collar and walked across the street to the church. Reverend Pottle was at the entrance, hanging a notice for Sunday services. Inspector, he said, adjusting the sign. More news of the whisper? Not exactly. I'd like to ask about the wreaths prepared for Mr. Midgley's funeral. Were any anonymous? Pottle frowned. All were signed, a surprising number actually. Mr. Midgley, though somewhat prickly, had many acquaintances. One wreath did arrive late, though only minutes before the service. Who delivered it? The undertaker's assistant. He said it had been left on their doorstep, with a note that it belonged with the others. Purbright nodded. May I see the list of arranged placements? Pottle produced a folded sheet from his pocket. Purbright scanned the entries. The wreath in question had been placed near the lectern, where the vicar read the commendation. A curious choice for something unspoken for. And this wreath, Purbright asked, was it similar to the one Miss Priddy received this morning? Pottle looked troubled. I did not inspect it closely, but the roses were white, I recall, quite fine ones. White roses again, a pattern forming in faint strokes. Purbright left the church and made for the undertaker's. Herbert Sims greeted him with his usual solemn politeness, though he seemed more nervous than before. Sir, he began, I was meaning to speak with you. Something odd occurred after the funeral yesterday. I didn't mention it because I wasn't sure it mattered. Please tell me. Sims swallowed. Someone came to the back entrance about an hour after the service. asked whether any wreaths had been left unclaimed, said they'd been sent one by mistake. And did they give a name? No, sir. Wore a coat with the collar up. I'm afraid I couldn't see their face at all, but they sounded tense, desperate even. Male or female? I'd say male, but soft-voiced. Purbright thanked him and walked out into the street again. The air smelled of damp stone and anticipation. Councilman Hargreaves' earlier defensiveness now aligned disquietingly with the emerging pattern. Anonymous wreaths, furtive questions, circled phrases Miss Priddy's fear. It all suggested someone had attempted to send a message and then regretted sending it, or had been frightened by its implications. But whom were they, warning or silencing? As he made his way back toward the station, Purbright's mind assembled the wreaths, the torn program, the whispered syllables, and Miss Priddy's panicked secrecy into the outline of something not yet fully visible. A shape forming behind the curtain. Not the velvet one in the church, but a different kind of curtain, the sort people wove to hide their own involvement. Someone in Flaxborough was trying very hard to speak without being seen. And someone else, equally determined, wanted that voice extinguished. Evening settled over Flaxborough with the unhurried gloom characteristic of early autumn, when the streets emptied more quickly than usual and the lamps flickered awake with mild reluctance. Inspector Purbright, having spent much of the day assembling the scattered threads of wreaths, whispers and evasions, decided to stop by the church once more before retiring to paperwork. Reverend Pottle often held evening prayers, and the building, with its stillness and dim amber glow, had a way of revealing things that daytime bustle tended to smother. As Purbright stepped into the nave, he found the vicar kneeling near the front, adjusting a candle wick with the meticulous attention of someone postponing concern. He rose at once upon noticing the inspector. "Ah, Inspector," Pottle said, voice low. "I had hoped you might stop by. Something rather disconcerting has occurred." Purbright moved closer, noting a faint but unmistakable scent. Burnt wiring. "Where, exactly?" "Behind the lectern," Pottle replied, gesturing nervously. "I was preparing the readings and noticed a strange smell. When I looked beneath the platform—" He paused, choosing his words with clerical caution. "Perhaps you had better see for yourself." Purbright knelt and peered under the wooden structure. There, half concealed by a panel, was a small reel-to-reel tape recorder, older but functional-looking, its casing blackened at one corner, as if a brief surge of heat had passed through it. A thread of melted plastic clung to the edge, like a congealed tear. Carefully, Purbright drew it out. Pottle whispered, "I assure you that was not there this morning." The machine was light enough to have been placed easily and quickly. Purbright examined the spools inside. One still carried a partial strip of tape. Whatever had been recorded had not survived intact, judging by the burnt edge, yet enough remained to warrant attention. "Did you turn it on?" Purbright asked. "Good heavens, no, I only removed the panel slightly, saw that thing, and replaced it. I feared touching it further might, well, set something off." Purbright suppressed a mild smile. "I think it has already set off all it intends." He flipped the small switch. The recorder clicked and whirred with faint reluctance, the tape juddering uneasily, as though unsure whether it should obey. For several seconds there was only static, soft, wavering, like cloth, brushing against wood. Then, beneath the noise, a faint breath. A slow, measured inhalation. Another. And then, unmistakably, a whisper. Just one word. Faint, distorted, but clear enough. "Priddy." Reverend Pottle clasped his hands to his chest. "I feared as much," he murmured. She insisted she heard no whisper on the day of the funeral. yet her name seems to be central. Purbright let the tape run to the end, where it clicked and spun out. He rewound it gently, careful not to damage the already fragile strip. "It's possible someone recorded this days ago," he said calmly. "Or last night. The timing may not be tied to the funeral at all." Pottle, however, looked unconvinced. "Inspector, someone must have crawled under the lectern during the service. Could the original whisper have been played from this device?" "The machine is old," Purbright said, lifting it by the strap. "Not silent enough to operate unnoticed. And given the number of witnesses claiming the whisper said different things, I doubt the sound was pre-recorded." "But the tape? My word, who would go to such trouble?" Purbright did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the velvet curtain near the choir stalls. It hung motionless, yet the faint smell of singed wiring seemed stronger here, as though whoever placed the device had come this way first. Perhaps they had tested it, or burned a section intentionally to obscure the original recording. The inspector parted the curtain and stepped once more into the alcove. Nothing had changed. The heater remained lifeless, the music stand stacked neatly, the shadows still soft and shallow. But Purbright noticed something new. A small fragment of blackened paper on the floor, no larger than a fingernail. He picked it up. "What is it?" Pottle asked from outside the alcove. "A remnant of something burned," Purbright replied. "Perhaps the tape itself. Or perhaps someone attempted to burn instructions or a note." "Do you suppose," Pottle asked nervously, "that this is connected to the wreath Miss Priddy received?" "I suspect everything unusual this week is connected," Purbright said. He exited the alcove and placed the recorder gently on a pew. The vicar hovered beside him, absorbing the gravity of the situation, with visible strain. "Inspector, is Miss Priddy in danger?" Purbright considered. "Possibly. Or she is the danger to someone else. Both encourage similar behaviour." Before Pottle could reply, the heavy church doors creaked open. Mrs. Beddington, the choir mistress, entered with the halting steps of someone expecting calamity and perhaps slightly hoping for it. When she saw Purbright holding the recorder, she gave a small shriek. "I knew it!" she cried. "I knew the whisper wasn't over!" "Evening, Mrs. Beddington," Purbright said calmly. "We found this beneath the lectern. It contains a recording." She clasped her throat melodramatically. "Of a whisper?" "Yes." "Was it my name?" she demanded with almost triumphant dread. "No," Purbright said gently. "It was Miss Priddy's." The choir mistress blinked, deflated. "Oh?" Then after a pause, "Well, that's odd." Purbright decided not to comment on the hierarchy of disappointment in her tone. "Did you observe anyone near the lectern after the service?" he asked. She shook her head vigorously. "I was in the sacristy organizing the hymnals. They were all out of order after the funeral, as if someone had rummaged through them." "I told the vicar, didn't I tell you, Reverend, that it's a grave discourtesy to disturb the numbering?" Pottle nodded wearily. "You told me." Purbright's mind caught on that detail. Hymnals disturbed, Colin Smeaton's earlier confession, the choir mistress arriving early. Something about hymn sheet numbering had stuck in his thoughts since Colin's explanation. Perhaps the disorder had occurred not before the funeral but after, and someone had blamed the boy retrospectively to obscure their own presence behind the curtain. He returned to the recorder. "Mrs. Beddington, who usually prepares the lectern before a service?" "I do," she said, puffing slightly with pride. "Though the vicar occasionally adjusts things, but for funerals I see to the hymns." "And was the lectern prepared when you arrived for Mr. Midgley's service?" "It was," she said. "Quite unusually so." "I thought the vicar had been early." Pottle looked startled. "I wasn't early. I arrived only 15 minutes before the service, and the lectern had already been arranged." Purbright turned to Mrs. Beddington. "Then who placed the hymn sheets?" She frowned deeply. I suppose I assumed Reverend Pottle had. Or perhaps the undertaker's assistant?" Sims seemed meticulous, but Purbright doubted the undertaker's staff would interfere with church ritual. The more likely explanation was that someone had arranged the lectern deliberately, either to hide the recorder or to ensure it would not be discovered until later. "Mrs. Beddington," Purbright said, "did you notice anyone lingering near the lectern before the choir gathered?" "No, I was in the vestry preparing my folder. But the door was slightly open, and I heard footsteps. Light ones. Male or female? I can't be certain, but the rhythm was quick, purposeful." Purbright exchanged a subtle glance with Reverend Pottle. Quick and purposeful footsteps tended not to belong to grieving widows or lethargic counsellors. He retrieved the recorder and paused before speaking. "Reverend, may I keep this? I believe someone placed it here with intent to intimidate Miss Priddy or perhaps to warn her." Pottle nodded. "Take whatever you need. I confess I feel, unsettled." As Purbright stepped into the cool night, recorder tucked safely under his arm, he reflected that the whisper, instead of fading into rumour, had now stepped boldly into physical form. Someone had shifted from suggestion to strategy. A whisper in the church was one thing, a whisper preserved on tape was another entirely. The second incident had changed the tone of the mystery. It was no longer merely a matter of who wanted to frighten the town or distract it, but who wanted Miss Priddy silenced, or at least rattled enough to act irrationally. And why? As Purbright walked toward the station under the thin drizzle, he felt the faint but unmistakable sense that someone had misjudged the scale of their own scheme. A whisper, after all, was meant to be fleeting, but, recorded, it became evidence. Inspector Purbright arrived at his office the next morning, with the tape recorder tucked neatly beneath his arm, and a faint sense that Flaxborough, in its industrious pursuit of gossip, might accidentally solve the case before he had the chance. Already the whisper had evolved into what some citizens referred to as the curse of the choir stalls, a title that suggested far more theatre than the town usually afforded reality. Still, behind the embellishments, something genuine was moving, quiet, deliberate, and increasingly uneasy. Sergeant Love was sorting through a pile of correspondence when Purbright entered. "Morning, sir," he said, glancing at the recorder. "I take it that's the contraption Reverend Pottle mentioned?" "It is," Purbright replied, setting it carefully on his desk. "A curious piece of theatre. Someone went to considerable trouble to stage a moment for Miss Priddy." "Do you think she's in danger?" Love asked. Purbright tapped a finger against the recorder's metal casing. "Possibly, but danger comes in many varieties. Some people fear exposure more than harm." Love frowned. "Exposure of what?" "That," Purbright said mildly, "remains to be seen." He sat back and allowed his thoughts to settle, the way one might let dust drift before identifying the footprints beneath. The whisper, the wreaths, the torn funeral program, the carefully placed recording, each act carried intention, yet none bore the hallmarks of sudden passion. This was someone who planned in small, intricate movements like shifting chess pieces a square at a time. And in Flaxborough, where grudges matured more slowly than cheese, such movements were rarely impulsive. A soft knock sounded at the door, and Constable Malley entered with the dutiful expression of someone hoping his theory had ripened overnight. "Sir," he began, "I've been thinking about that Smeaton lad. His story about borrowing a hymn sheet seems unlikely, Boys his age don't much care for Victorian handwriting." "True," Purbright said, "but they do care about avoiding disapproval from choir mistresses, a motive equally strong and far more probable." Mally blinked in mild confusion. "So, you believe him?" "Let's say I believe the part that matters. But by all means continue observing him from a respectful distance. He may notice something the rest of us overlook." Dismissed but encouraged, Mally withdrew. Love, leaning against the filing cabinet, rubbed his chin. "If not the boy, then who's got reason to frighten Miss Priddy? Or frame her?" Purbright closed his eyes briefly. "Consider the habits of funerals, Sergeant. They are peculiar occasions, full of emotion, reputation, and opportunity. People reveal themselves in how they mourn, but more often in how they are observed mourning. A whisper in such a setting is a remarkably targeted device. One can frighten a single person while unsettling an entire congregation." "So the whisper wasn't meant for the town," Love said slowly. "It was meant for her. Or someone else, who then recognized it." "Precisely." Before Love could reply, the telephone rang. Purbright lifted the receiver. It was Reverend Pottle, sounding as though he had swallowed one too many anxieties with his breakfast. "Inspector, I hesitate to alarm you further, but something else has occurred. A parishioner, Mrs. Gelthorpe, came to clean the memorial alcove this morning and found the flowers tampered with." "In what way?" Purbright asked. "The wreath placed there after Mr. Midgley's funeral, the anonymous one, it's missing several roses, cleanly removed." "When did she last see it intact?" "Yesterday afternoon. She is quite sure of that." Purbright assured him he would stop by shortly, then set down the receiver. Love frowned. "Someone's harvesting roses now?" "Removing," Purbright corrected. "A distinction worth noting." He stood, slipped the recorder into a drawer, and gestured toward the door. "Come along, Sergeant. The dead seem to be shedding their tributes." The church was quiet when they arrived, though faint organ notes drifted from the loft, where an enthusiastic amateur was practicing with more zeal than accuracy. Reverend Pottle met them at the door and led them to the memorial alcove, a small recess where wreaths rested under stained glass light. Sure enough, the anonymous wreath had been altered. Several white roses were missing, leaving only neat gaps where stems had been expertly cut. Love crouched to inspect it. "Neat work. Not vandalism?" "No," Purbright agreed. "Someone with knowledge of floral arrangement and a sharp blade." Pottle swallowed. "Do you think, Miss Priddy—" Purbright raised a calming hand. "Let us avoid assuming guilt through profession." Still, he could not ignore the connection. White roses again, removed deliberately. Someone had taken parts of the anonymous wreath, but to hide something, reuse it, or destroy evidence. "Has anyone else been in the church today?" Purbright asked. "Only Mrs. Gelthorpe," Pottle said. "And Councilman Hargreave briefly. He said he wished to inspect the heating system. I'm not entirely sure why." Purbright nodded. Not sure why indeed. Hargreave's involvement had been too controlled, too anxious, yet his fussiness might merely be civic pride, unless civic pride now included tampering with wreaths under stained glass. As they examined the alcove, a soft clatter echoed from the side aisle. Purbright turned swiftly. Miss Priddy stood frozen near the pillar, a metal pail at her feet. She had evidently dropped it at the sight of the two officers. Her face flushed too quickly. "I was just watering," she stammered. "Reverend Pottle asked me, well, he didn't ask, but I assumed. Someone must tend the flowers." Pottle blinked. "I never—" Miss Priddy's voice rose. "Is it a crime to maintain floral dignity?" Purbright answered gently. not in the least. But her panic was too immediate, too defensive. And her eyes flicked just once toward the altered wreath before snapping away as though scorched. Purbright approached with care, like one might approach a bird, determined not to reveal the broken twig under its wing. "Miss Priddy," he said, "did you happen to notice anything amiss here this morning?" She shook her head violently. "No, nothing. Why should I?" "Because someone has removed roses from that wreath." Her breath caught in a small, betraying sound. Pottle, alarmed, intervened. "My dear, are you unwell?" Miss Priddy steadied herself with visible effort. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin. I don't know who would do such a thing. People meddle. They always meddle." Purbright watched her carefully. "When was the last time you saw this wreath intact?" She hesitated. "Yesterday. Afternoon, before closing." "You were here after the funeral, then?" She flinched. "I came to check the arrangements. It is my duty as the town's primary florist." Love, who was not usually perceptive in subtleties, caught the tremor in her tone. Purbright saw it too, the pressure of secrets bending her movements, her words, her breath. "Miss Priddy," he said quietly, "if someone has threatened you—" "No one has," she said far too quickly. "I must return to my shop." She retrieved her pail and hurried out, almost tripping on the stone step. Pottle looked helplessly at Purbright. "She's frightened." "Yes," Purbright said softly, "but not of us." After leaving the church, Purbright and Love walked slowly toward the station, the damp morning drawing out the scents of old stone and autumn leaves. Purbright kept his hands clasped behind him, his stride thoughtful. "Sir," Love ventured, "you think the wreath, the whisper, the recorder, they're all linked to Miss Priddy?" "Not simply to her," Purbright replied, "to something she knows, or once knew. Something someone wishes she would forget." Love scratched his head. "She doesn't seem the type to meddle in anything complicated." "Precisely why someone may believe she would not withstand pressure." Purbright gave a faint smile. People often misjudge the quietly anxious. As they neared the station, Purbright paused. "Sergeant, what do we know of Mr. Midgley's business affairs before his death?" "Only that he dealt in furniture. Kept modest books, no complaints filed." "Yet Mrs. Midgley hinted at troubling matters," Purbright murmured. "And Hargreave, a counsellor with reasons to avoid attention, has been unusually visible since the funeral." "You think Cyril Midgley left behind more than a walnut bureau with sticking drawers?" Love said half-jokingly. "I think," Purbright said, resuming his walk, "that the dead man's affairs may be whispering louder than the living one's voice." And for the first time since Cyril Midgley's funeral, Purbright felt the mystery shift, not in volume, but in clarity. The motives were no longer drifting like mist. They were beginning to gather shape. Behind the curtain, behind the wreaths, behind the whisper recorded for a single name, someone had begun to fear the consequences of their own secrets. And fear, Purbright knew, was the most revealing whisper of all. The autumn wind worried at the edges of Flaxborough all afternoon, shuffling leaves along the pavements and stirring the air with a restless chill that seemed peculiarly in tune with Inspector Purbright's growing sense that the mystery had begun to widen. What had begun as a whisper at a funeral had stretched its fingers into wreaths, tapes, and anxious florists, and now, he suspected, into the more bureaucratic corners of the town's affairs. He spent the early afternoon reviewing Cyril Midgley's modest file at the station. Though to call it modest was generous, Midgley appeared to have lived a life of careful neutrality. No complaints lodged, no debts recorded, no disputes noted. His furniture business, the ledgers showed, had been maintained with quiet precision. too quiet, Purbright realized after a few pages. The figures were neat, yes, but perfectly neat. No discrepancies, no unexpected fluctuations, no errors, no corrections. It was the financial equivalent of a vase balanced exactly in the center of a polished table, and people like Midgley, in Purbright's experience, seldom kept such immaculate books without a reason. He closed the file and walked to the window. Outside, Love was speaking with Mrs. Dapple from the bakery, whose hands fluttered like two anxious birds each time she mentioned the whisper. People were becoming more nervous, not less, and fear, once seeded, tended to root itself in the soil of rumour rather than fact. Purbright turned from the window as the telephone on his desk rang. He lifted the receiver. "Inspector Purbright speaking." A familiar, if somewhat strained voice answered, Mrs. Midgley. I think there is something you should know," she said, each word slow, as if first weighed and then cautiously released. "But not over the telephone. Could you come to the house?" "Of course," Purbright replied. "I shall be there shortly." He put on his coat and informed Love, who offered a look of reluctant encouragement, as though he feared what might be unearthed next. The walk to the Midgley home took Purbright past the more modest row of houses along Chancel Lane. Mrs. Midgley answered the door almost before he knocked, suggesting she had been standing in the hall, waiting. Her eyes, though composed, held the fragile shine of someone balancing between secrecy and confession. "Thank you for coming," she said, leading him to a small sitting room decorated with floral wallpaper and a modest array of furniture, all presumably from her husband's shop. She gestured to a chair. "Please sit." Purbright did, folding his hands calmly in his lap. "You mentioned something troubling you." Mrs. Midgley sighed. "It's about Cyril's will, or rather, about the changes he was planning before he died." "Changes?" Purbright asked. "Meaning he intended to alter beneficiaries?" "He said he wanted to revise things," she said, voice low. "But he did not tell me who the new recipient was meant to be." "Only that it was someone who deserved a chance to make things right." His words, not mine. Purbright considered this. "Did he mention the name at any point, even indirectly?" "No, but 3 weeks before he died, he had a visitor." Her eyes dropped to her hands. "Miss Priddy?" Purbright blinked with mild surprise. "The florist?" "Yes." She swallowed. "Cyril said she needed help, that she had got herself into something awkward. After she left, he told me he needed to adjust the will, but wouldn't say more." Purbright felt the internal shift of a puzzle piece finding its adjacent edge. "Did Miss Priddy return after that?" "Once," Mrs. Midgley said. 2 days later, she looked distressed. Cyril told her to give him time to arrange matters, whatever that meant. "And then?" Purbright asked gently. "And then nothing. She never came again." A silence settled, fragile and careful. Purbright leaned back slightly. "Has anyone else approached you since the funeral?" She hesitated. "Well, yes. Councilman Hargreave visited yesterday morning. He said he was offering personal support as a friend of Cyril's, though to my knowledge they hardly spoke. He asked whether Cyril had left any documents needing council attention." "What sort of documents?" "He didn't say. He was evasive. He left quickly when I said Cyril kept no records relating to the council." Purbright left shortly afterward, thanking her for her candour. As he stepped back into the chilly air, his mind sifted through the implications. Miss Priddy, whose anxiety had sharpened with every new development, had been connected to Cyril shortly before his death. Cyril had intended to amend his will, perhaps naming her. And Councilman Hargreave, already defensive at the funeral, had sought information about documents Cyril might have held. The circle was widening, and within it, motives layered themselves like petals around a hidden bud. Purbright walked toward the centre of town, taking a detour by the council building. Its brick exterior gave it an air of officious calm, but Purbright knew buildings seldom reflected the tensions within. Inside, clerks shuffled papers and councillors murmured in corners with the vague importance of men who feared being overheard. He found Hargreave in his office, straightening a stack of files that did not seem in need of straightening. "Inspector," Hargreave exclaimed, "twice in 2 days. Good heavens, you'll start rumours." "Rumours seem to thrive regardless," Purbright said mildly. Hargreave laughed nervously. True. What brings you here?" "A question," Purbright said, "regarding funeral procurement." Hargreave stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Procurement?" "Yes, I've been told the council oversees certain contracts relating to floral arrangements for public funerals. Is that correct?" Hargreave cleared his throat. "Well, yes. We maintain a list of approved suppliers." "And Miss Priddy is one of them?" "She was," Hargreave said. "We had concerns about her pricing structure. Cyril Midgley raised the matter last year. He claimed she charged differently for different customers." Purbright nodded slightly. "And was anything done?" "We discussed removing her from the list." Hargreave shifted, but nothing was finalized. Did Cyril intend to submit a formal complaint? Hargreave's fingers drummed a restless rhythm on his desk. Perhaps he mentioned something about it, but he always gave people too many chances, in my opinion. Soft-heartedness has no place in commerce. "Indeed," Purbright said gently. When he left Hargreave's office, the councillor's discomfort lingered in the air like the faint smell of burnt dust. It wasn't guilt, not quite. More the nervousness of someone whose plans were no longer aligned with the direction events had taken. Purbright returned to the station, where Love greeted him with a fresh development. "Sir," he said, holding out a thin envelope. "This came for you. No return address, delivered by hand." Inside was a slip of paper torn from a funeral program, again from Cyril Midgley's service. This time, a different line was circled. Hymn number 94. Below it, in untidy pencil, someone had written, "Ask her what she did." Love frowned. "Her? Meaning Miss Priddy?" Purbright studied the note, his mind tracing the careful sequence of events. Someone wanted Miss Priddy questioned. Someone wanted attention, directed her way, but not too directly. A whisper at the funeral, a taped message under the lectern, altered wreaths, resurrected suspicions. All these were nudges. The work of someone who wished to remain unseen, yet ensure that others were seen too clearly. "Sir," Love said quietly, "whoever sent this is playing a complicated game." "Yes," Purbright murmured, "and they're beginning to play it badly." He slipped the note into his pocket and stared thoughtfully at the damp street outside. The shape behind the whisper was growing edges, petty grievances, hidden transactions, a revised will, a frightened florist, a councillor with too much to lose. The town, in its small, familiar way, was revealing a web of lives connected not by affection, but by quiet obligation and inconvenient memories. And somewhere among them, someone had decided to use a whisper to keep a secret from being spoken. Inspector Purbright rose early the next morning, the faint sunlight creeping reluctantly over the roofs of Flaxborough. The night had been long, but his thoughts had been longer. The whisper, the wreaths, the tape recorder, the shifted hymn numbers, the councillor's anxiety, the widow's hinted secrets, all of them had arranged themselves not as random fragments, but as pieces of a pattern whose outline he could now just begin to discern. What remained was to see how each person reacted when placed, oh so politely, within that pattern. He arrived at the station before Sergeant Love, and by the time the sergeant appeared with a steaming mug and the look of a man wrestling with insufficient sleep, Purbright had already drafted a short list of individuals he intended to see that day. Love set the mug down. "You're here early, sir. Any progress?" "In a manner of speaking," Purbright said, "but progress, like gossip, must be guided if one wishes it to go in the correct direction." Love blinked, accustomed to Purbright's metaphors, but never entirely certain what portion of them was literal. "Shall I prepare interview rooms?" "No interviews, not yet. A conversation or two, and a gathering." "A gathering?" Purbright folded the list and placed it in his coat pocket. "Yes, in the vestry of the church this afternoon. Miss Priddy, Councilman Hargreave, the choir mistress, the undertaker's assistant, and Mrs. Midgley." Love hesitated. "All in one room?" "Not for confrontation," Purbright said mildly. "For observation." Love nodded slowly. "Ah, your kind of observation." "Quite." Before assembling them, however, Purbright knew he must speak individually with each, not to interrogate, no, that would only stiffen their defences, but to offer small prompts, carefully placed, which might loosen something else entirely. He began with Herbert Sims. The undertaker's assistant answered the door with hands still powdered from polishing urn shelves. "Inspector," he said nervously, "I've not found anything new, if that's what you're here about." "That is quite all right," Purbright replied. "I merely wanted to clarify a detail. The anonymous wreath. Delivered on the day of Mr. Midgley's funeral. Was it you who carried it in?" "Yes, sir. I found it on our doorstep with the note that it belonged with the others." "No handwriting? No initials?" "No, sir. Just typed." Purbright nodded and paused, deliberately letting silence suggest further expectation. Sims predictably filled it. "There is one thing," he said quietly. "The roses. They were unusual, very fine quality. Miss Priddy doesn't stock that grade. Far too expensive for most." "And who in town would?" Purbright asked gently. Sims swallowed. "Councilman Hargreave. He had special rose orders last year for the mayoral luncheon. Imported varieties." So another thread linking Hargreave to the wreaths. Purbright thanked him and left him to his polishing. Next, he visited Mrs. Beddington, who was rehearsing hymns in her sitting room, using an organ whose volume seemed unsuited to the fragility of her furniture. "Inspector," she exclaimed when he entered. "Do not tell me the whisper has evolved again." "Not that I'm aware of," Purbright said pleasantly. "I had a question about hymn number 94. She froze. 94? Oh dear. Well, that hymn was slightly out of order on the day of the funeral. Something I corrected, of course, naturally." "Of course," Purbright echoed with gentle encouragement. She fussed with sheet music, clearly unsettled. "But it was not my error. Someone had been through them before I arrived. You know how I feel about misplacement." "A strong stance," Purbright said. "Did you mention this to anyone?" "Only the vicar, but he assumed I was fussing." "And were you?" "I always am," she admitted. "But that does not make me wrong." Purbright inclined his head politely, offering a faint smile that suggested she had provided something useful. That was enough to send her into further fretful reflection, which he hoped might reveal more later. Miss Priddy was next. She flinched when the doorbell of her shop chimed. "Inspector," she said through strained breath, "I have no new information. Truly." "I believe you," Purbright said. "But something troubles me. Someone removed roses from the anonymous wreath in the church. A practised hand. Very clean work." She went pale. "You think I think," Purbright interrupted softly. That someone wants you to believe you are being implicated or wants others to believe it. Her lips trembled. I didn't touch that wreath. I didn't go near it. Purbright stepped aside lightly, allowing space. Someone fears what you know about Mr. Midgley's dealings. Perhaps they fear the reason he wished to change his will. She stared at him, astonished, though her reaction carried not guilt, but a dawning recognition. Something clicked behind her eyes, something she had tried to push away. Purbright did not push her further. Instead, he said only, "Please come to the vestry this afternoon. There is nothing to fear, quite the opposite, in fact." He left before she could refuse. Councilman Hargreave was the last individual visit. He welcomed Purbright with forced cheerfulness. "Inspector, I hope this is not about those wild rumours concerning me and wreath tampering. Absolute nonsense." Purbright smiled mildly. "I didn't realize there were rumours, Councilman." Hargreave blinked, horrified at his slip. "Well, people talk." "Yes," Purbright said, "and they will talk less when the matter is resolved. I am gathering a few individuals in the church vestry later. Your presence would be appreciated." "What for?" Hargreave asked, voice thinning. "A simple clarification." Hargreave hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "Very well, if it helps dispel this foolishness." Purbright departed with a polite nod. By 3 o'clock, the vestry was arranged exactly as Purbright wished. Chairs in a loose semicircle, the faint smell of stone and polish lingering. Reverend Pottle hovered with nervous curiosity, but agreed to leave them alone once Purbright assured him this was not a disciplinary matter, at least not for the clergy. One by one the guests arrived. Miss Priddy sat rigidly, twisting her gloves. Hargreave took a position far from her, feigning nonchalance. Mrs. Beddington perched on the edge of her chair, primly alert. Sims stood near the door, uncertain whether sitting was allowed. Mrs. Midgley arrived last, serene but tense. Purbright stood before them, hands loosely clasped. "Thank you all for coming," he said pleasantly. "I have invited you because you are connected, not by accusation but by circumstance, and I require only one thing from each of you." They watched him, some fearful, some defensive. "A question," Purbright continued, "which each of you will answer in turn, simply and truthfully. Nothing more." Miss Priddy swallowed. Hargreave lifted his chin. The air in the room tightened. Purbright's tone remained polite, almost gentle. "Where were you at the precise moment the whisper was heard during Mr. Midgley's funeral?" A small question, an innocent one, but one that could not be answered truthfully by everyone present, not without consequence. Miss Priddy's breath hitched first. Hargreave's fingers twitched toward his collar. Mrs. Beddington blinked rapidly, her certainty collapsing into scrambling recollection. Sims shrank. Mrs. Midgley closed her eyes briefly as though preparing herself. And in that instant, before anyone spoke, Purbright saw it, the guilt, the fear, the contradiction forming like a crack in glass. His gentle test had worked. One of them, he knew, had just realized the truth could no longer be whispered. The vestry held its breath. Purbright, who had spent decades mastering the art of patient silence, allowed it to stretch just long enough for discomfort to settle into each of the 5 faces before him. He knew that truth, particularly unwelcome truth, often emerged not through interrogation, but through the quiet panic of being left alone with one's own thoughts. He did not ask the question again. He merely waited. It was Mrs. Beddington who broke first. I was in the vestry," she blurted out, clutching her handbag as if it were a flotation device. As I said before, preparing my hymn folder, strictly routine. Hargreave snorted softly. Preparing it? At your usual volume? You were rustling papers loudly enough for the whole organ loft to hear. No one could mistake that for a whisper. Her mouth opened indignantly, but Purbright cut in gently. Thank you, Mrs. Beddington. You may sit. He turned to the undertaker's assistant. Mr. Sims? Sims cleared his throat. I was near the choir stalls, sir. The left side. I'd just finished adjusting the flower stands. I didn't move from that place until the commendation ended. Purbright nodded, neither affirming nor doubting. Mrs. Midgley? The widow straightened slightly. I was in the second pew, alone. I didn't turn around when I heard the whisper, if I heard it at all. I wasn't certain whether the sound was meant for me, or simply my imagination. Her voice held a quiet sincerity. Purbright inclined his head. Then he looked at Miss Priddy. She stiffened immediately. I was at the back, as I told you already. I heard nothing, I saw nothing, whatever people are saying. Miss Priddy, Purbright interrupted softly. You were in the third pew from the front. Her lips parted soundlessly. Yes, he continued, you seated yourself there out of obligation. The Midgleys had ordered flowers from you for years. You wished to be seen paying respects. That is admirable, but it does mean your earlier statements were deliberately false. Miss Priddy swallowed. I didn't lie, not really. I simply misremembered. Purbright gave her a look of gentle patience. Quite. And Councilman Hargreave? The councillor shifted, tugging at his collar. I told you, I was in the back row, far right. Purbright raised an eyebrow. Mr. Hargreave, you were not in the back. Young Collins Smeaton, not known for subtlety, pointed you out as being in the middle section, near the aisle. And the choir mistress noticed you, glancing repeatedly toward the lectern. Hargreave flushed. I only looked because the vicar was struggling with the reading. It was entirely innocent. Oh, I don't doubt your glances, Purbright said pleasantly. The question is why you were so interested in that corner of the church. Hargreave's jaw tensed. Miss Priddy wrung her gloves until they twisted like rope. Mrs. Midgley sat very still, her gaze thoughtful. Mrs. Beddington was visibly strategizing the least humiliating emotion to display. Purbright allowed the silence to settle again. I should like, he began, to take us back to the beginning, to Cyril Midgley, a tradesman known for modesty, reliability, and importantly, discretion. Yet just before his death, he was preparing to amend his will. He told his wife the new beneficiary deserved a chance to make things right. Miss Priddy looked down sharply, her breath catching. Purbright continued. 3 weeks before he died, Miss Priddy visited him twice, and soon after, Cyril expressed concern privately that she was entangled in something awkward, not criminal necessarily, but socially precarious. Hargreave shifted again, a tremor betraying nerves more effectively than words. And then, Purbright said, Cyril died. Suddenly, not suspiciously in the medical sense, but unexpectedly before he could legally make those changes. The person he intended to help was left exposed. Purbright let his gaze rest gently on Miss Priddy. She avoided his eyes. It seems someone worried, he continued, that Miss Priddy might reveal why she sought Cyril's help, or that she might be accused of influencing his intentions, and so attempts were made to frighten her into silence. He paused. The whispered warning, the anonymous wreaths, the torn program with circled lines, the recording placed beneath the lectern, and finally the roses removed from the wreath to make it appear she was tampering with evidence. Miss Priddy gasped softly. Mrs. Beddington crossed herself reflexively. Sims looked horrified. Hargreaves' hands tightened around his knees. Purbright's voice remained courteous. "Miss Priddy, you did not stage any of this, but you know what it concerns." She shook her head, then nodded, then shook her head again, her thoughts fighting for dominance. Finally, she whispered, "I only wanted help. Cyril promised he would handle it quietly. He said altering his will would protect me. He never explained how." "Because," Purbright said gently, "the person he intended to protect you from was on the council, a person with influence. Someone who could damage your business, reputation, and livelihood. Someone who already had." Hargreaves stood abruptly. "This is outrageous! Inspector, I'll not sit here and be slandered." Purbright raised a hand. "Please sit, Councilman." Hargreave hovered, trembling with indignation, but he sat. Purbright's tone remained calm. "Last year, Councilman Hargreave, you began removing Miss Priddy from the approved suppliers list. For cause," Hargreave snapped, "her prices were inconsistent." "Because she refused," Purbright said quietly, "to pay you a commission for referrals." Miss Priddy covered her mouth. Mrs. Beddington gasped. Mrs. Midgley's eyes closed, a sorrowful confirmation. Hargreaves' face went a mottled red. "That's a lie. Cyril Midgley discovered it," Purbright continued. "He confronted you privately. You tried to persuade him to let the matter drop. He refused, but he also chose not to expose you publicly. He preferred a quieter resolution. That resolution was to name Miss Priddy in his will to cover whatever damage you might continue to cause." Miss Priddy let out a trembling breath. Hargreaves' voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You have no proof." "No," Purbright agreed pleasantly. "I have your behavior, which is far more conclusive," he continued before Hargreave could interrupt. "You were seen lingering near the vestry after the funeral. You arranged special roses last year, the same type found on the anonymous wreath. You attempted to retrieve that wreath after the service. You returned to the church yesterday, pretending to inspect heating. And you were the only person in town with access to both council stationery and the procurement files Cyril held." Hargreaves' jaw twitched. "You placed the recorder. You whispered behind the curtain. And when that failed to frighten Miss Priddy into silence, you escalated. But the more you manipulated, the more tangled your motives became." The vestry was silent, except for the rain tapping faintly at the stained glass. Finally, Mrs. Midgley spoke softly. "Cyril told me he was trying to help someone who had been wronged. He said he didn't want the council ruining another life. I believe now he meant Miss Priddy." Purbright nodded. Miss Priddy burst into tears, quiet, exhausted tears that came from months of intimidation. Hargreaves sagged back in his chair, his earlier arrogance evaporating into dull dread. Purbright spoke gently, as though concluding a lesson rather than delivering judgment. "A whisper is a delicate weapon, Councilman, but it cannot hide a truth that insists on being heard." He turned to Sims. "Would you kindly accompany Councilman Hargreave outside and ask Sergeant Love to join us?" Sims nodded solemnly, gesturing for Hargreave to rise. Hargreave hesitated, then stood, less a councilman now and more a man who had finally run out of curtains to hide behind. When they left, Purbright turned back to the remaining three. "If I may offer reassurance," he said softly, "the matter will proceed with propriety. And Miss Priddy, Cyril Midgley intended to protect you. In the end, his intention was fulfilled." She nodded weakly. Mrs. Midgley reached for her hand, offering a fragile, unexpected solidarity. And Purbright, quiet, patient Purbright, felt the last thread of the whisper settle into place. Not as menace, but as motive exposed, Flaxborough had always possessed a talent for returning to its routines with the gentle swiftness of a cat settling back onto a freshly warmed cushion. Even so, in the days that followed Councilman Hargreaves' discreet removal from public view, Sergeant Love insisted on the term temporary detainment, though in truth the councillor had folded more rapidly than a paper map in the rain. The town underwent a curious softening. It was not a transformation so much as an adjustment of posture, like a stiff spine finally acknowledging its own discomfort. The whisper, once the centerpiece of speculation, had begun to dissolve into the background of more palatable gossip. Mrs. Glossop decided it had all been a misunderstanding, though she mentioned the word haunting often enough that one suspected she was reluctant to let it vanish entirely. Mr. Frolsham maintained that his version, UO, must have been correct, given how things turned out. The choir mistress declared she had always known something was awry in the ecclesiastical sphere, as though her intuition had guided the entire investigation. Yet for all this collective self-congratulation, conversations grew quieter when Miss Priddy passed by. Not in judgment, surprisingly, but in a sort of reverent caution, as though the florist had acquired an aura of fragile heroism. Her steps, once brisk with defensive pride, now carried a gentler rhythm. She no longer flinched at every creak of a shop door. She arranged lilies with something resembling calm. Inspector Purbright saw little of her during those days, which he took as a sign that she was beginning to reclaim the simple dignity of her work. But on a grey morning, near the end of the week, she appeared at the station holding a small bouquet of pale pink carnations. "I wanted," she said, with the hesitant dignity of someone unused to offering gratitude, "to thank you, Inspector. I didn't know how to do it without seeming foolish." Purbright accepted the flowers with mild surprise. "Your thanks are appreciated, Miss Priddy, but unnecessary. My role is a humble one." She offered a faint smile, an expression that had seemed impossible a week earlier. "Humble or not, you were the only person who asked what was wrong rather than what was wrong with me." Purbright inclined his head. She left shortly after, returning to her shop, where a new order of roses awaited sorting. Pink, not white. A subtle rejection of the colour that had draped her fear. Later that afternoon, Purbright visited Mrs. Midgley. The widow greeted him warmly and invited him into the sitting-room, where the same walnut bureau stood, its drawers still complaining with theatrical indignation whenever touched. She poured tea with a steadier hand than before. "You were right," she said, after a reflective sip. Cyril always preferred quiet solutions. He would have hated scandal, but he would have hated injustice even more. Purbright nodded. He seems to have trusted his judgment. He did. I only wish he had spoken plainly. But that was never his way. He liked to think a gentle hint could replace a firm explanation. "A philosophy many share," Purbright murmured, though whispers often fail to carry the full message. She smiled at that. "And yet yours did." He left her with the sense that grief, though still present, had found a softer resting place, no longer sharpened by unanswered question. As he stepped outside, the autumn sun broke through the clouds with brief insistence, casting a warm glow across the street. A small group of townsfolk stood near the bakery, exchanging mild gossip about new council elections. Even their murmurs held a different quality now, less judgmental, more contemplative, as though the whisper had reminded them of something essential about the fragility of appearances. It was nearly closing time when Purbright returned to the station. Sergeant Love was sorting files with the grim perseverance of someone determined to finish at least one task before the day dissolved entirely. "All quiet, sir?" he said, "assuming you don't count Mr. Cadwell's complaint that someone rearranged his sweet displays." Again. "A tragedy of sizable proportions," Purbright said lightly. Love grinned. And Mrs. Beddington wants to know whether the church should install new curtains in case the old ones have absorbed malign influence. I said I'd pass along the message. Very well, Purbright said, setting his hat on the hook. Though I suspect the influence is neither malign nor absorbable. Love hesitated. Begging your pardon, sir. Do you think Hargreave acted alone, or was someone helping him? Purbright sat, considering. No accomplice, just a man who believed his influence afforded him immunity. People who operate quietly in their own favor often underestimate the noise their actions make in the minds of others. Love nodded. Makes you think, doesn't it? About how much goes on under our noses. In a town this small, you'd think secrets would die quickly. On the contrary, Purbright replied, small towns preserve secrets with great devotion. What they bury is the truth, until, of course, it whispers its way back. He returned to his paperwork with the slow, contented rhythm of someone reacquainting himself with ordinary matters. The comfort of routine was a balm after the delicate threads of the past week. Petty reports, noise complaints, inquiries about lost umbrellas, these were the familiar bricks that built the walls of his day. Yet now and then his gaze drifted toward the drawer where he had placed the tape recorder. He had no reason to keep it. It was evidence enough for administrative purposes, but no longer necessary for the case. Still, he found himself reluctant to send it immediately to archives. There was something about its quiet, faintly singed presence that lingered, as though it too had absorbed a piece of Flaxborough's peculiar hush. Dusk settled early, folding the town into its soft indigo. Purbright stepped outside for a moment before locking up, breathing in the cool air. Church bells chimed distantly, their tones drifting gently through the streets. He walked a short distance, hands clasped behind him, observing the evening life. The baker turning his sign to closed, schoolchildren chasing the last scraps of playtime, couples strolling with the contented slowness of those with no urgent destination. All as it had been, all as it would continue to be. Yet something intangible had shifted, something quiet, something nearly invisible. A sense of eased tension, perhaps, or an acknowledgement that even in a town accustomed to burying its trouble beneath polite routines, truth had a way of emerging in the most unexpected form. A whisper behind a curtain, a single name on a damaged tape, a florist trembling behind a counter, a counsellor undone not by evidence, but by the miscalculation of human nature. Purbright drew in a thoughtful breath. He turned back toward the station, content to leave the day behind, satisfied that balance had been restored, however temporarily, to the small, peculiar world of Flaxborough. And as he sat once more at his desk, pen poised over a fresh sheet of paper, he found himself faintly amused by the simple, undeniable lesson the case had quietly offered. Some mysteries begin loudly, others begin with a whisper. This one, he thought with a faint, wry smile, had begun with both,